The fall of a modern empire rarely happens the way people imagine it. There is no single dramatic moment when everything collapses overnight. No sirens, no instant market crash that suddenly erases a global power from history. Instead, the fall follows a pattern, quiet, gradual, and deeply structural, like fractures forming beneath a massive dam. The system weakens long before the public notices the first leak. Today, we are going to examine what some analysts call the hidden blueprint of imperial decline, a recurring pattern. This recurring pattern has appeared throughout history. From ancient powers to modern superpowers, the sequence unfolds in stages. Each stage appears manageable. Each stage is explained away as temporary. But by the time the final phase appears, the system has already crossed a point of no return. Most people think empires collapse because of wars, political revolutions, or sudden economic disasters. But history shows something different. The true collapse begins long before the visible disasters. It begins when the internal structure of an empire becomes so fragile, even the tools designed to stabilize it, policy, debt, stimulus, intervention, stop working. To understand this process, we must first understand the illusion that holds modern systems together. In the modern world, stability is not only built on military strength or economic production, it is built on confidence. Global markets run on trust. Governments borrow money based on trust. Currencies hold value based on trust. Financial systems operate because billions of people collectively believe that tomorrow will look roughly like today. But confidence is a delicate structure. Once cracks appear, the system begins to behave differently. Economists and historians have identified a sequence that tends to repeat across centuries. It starts with expansion, followed by dominance, then saturation, then systemic strain. Eventually, the system reaches stage 5, the phase where the architecture itself begins to fail. But to understand stage 5, we must start at the beginning of the blueprint. The first stage of a rising empire is productivity. This is the era of innovation, industrial growth, and expanding economic output. Infrastructure is built, trade routes expand, manufacturing grows rapidly, wealth is created through real production. In this stage, the currency of the empire becomes stronger because it is backed by tangible economic power. The system grows because it produces more than it consumes. The second stage is financial expansion. As wealth accumulates, the empire begins to build sophisticated financial systems. Banks expand, credit becomes easier to obtain, investment accelerates growth even further. At this point, financial power begins to rival industrial power. Markets grow faster than physical production. This stage often looks like prosperity, and in many ways it is, but something subtle begins to change. Wealth generation slowly shifts from production to financial engineering. The third stage is global dominance. The empire's currency becomes the primary medium of international trade. Other nations begin holding it as reserves. The financial system spreads worldwide. This creates an enormous advantage. The empire can borrow more easily than others. It can run deficits without immediate consequences. Its currency becomes the foundation of global liquidity. But hidden within this advantage is a dangerous transformation. Because when a currency becomes the backbone of the global system, the issuing nation gains the ability to finance itself through debt instead of productivity. And over time, the temptation to use that privilege becomes overwhelming. This leads us to stage 4. Stage 4 is the era of structural imbalance. Production gradually moves elsewhere where labor is cheaper. Domestic economies shift towards services and finance. Asset markets begin to grow faster than wages. Wealth becomes increasingly concentrated. To maintain growth, governments begin relying more heavily on debt. Central banks intervene more frequently to stabilize markets. Interest rates become a critical lever. At first, these interventions appear successful. Crises occur, but they are contained. Markets fall, but they recover. Each intervention reinforces the belief that policymakers have control. But each intervention also pushes the system deeper into dependency. Debt accumulates, asset prices inflate, economic growth becomes increasingly reliant on monetary stimulus. Eventually, the system reaches a threshold where removing that stimulus becomes impossible without triggering instability. This is the entry point into stage 5, the phase most people never recognize until it is already underway. Stage 5 is not defined by a single event. It is defined by a loss of effectiveness. The tools that once stabilized the system begin to lose their power. Interest rate adjustments stop influencing economic behavior the way they once did. Monetary stimulus produces weaker results. Government spending increases but fails to generate sustainable growth. At this stage, policymakers face a dilemma with no easy solution. If they tighten policy, the debt burden becomes unsustainable and markets contract violently. If they loosen policy, inflation begins eroding purchasing power and financial credibility. Either direction introduces instability. This is the moment when fiscal and monetary tools begin to look less like solutions and more like temporary patches on a system that is structurally failing. But the most important feature of Stage 5 is psychological. The public narrative continues to insist that stability remains intact. Official forecasts project recovery. Markets oscillate between optimism and fear. Yet beneath the surface, the architecture has changed. Debt grows faster than the economy. Financial markets become increasingly volatile. Confidence becomes fragile, and the gap between real economic productivity and financial asset valuations widens dramatically. History shows that once an empire enters this stage, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse course. Because reversing course would require painful structural adjustments, reducing debt, rebuilding production capacity, restructuring financial systems. Those adjustments are politically and socially difficult. Governments often delay them as long as possible. Instead, the system attempts to extend the cycle through liquidity injections, monetary easing, and emergency interventions. Each extension buys time, but it also deepens the structural imbalance. At this point, external shocks become far more dangerous than they once were. A geopolitical conflict, a banking crisis, a commodity shock, or a sudden loss of investor confidence can trigger chain reactions throughout the financial system. Because the system is no longer resilient, it is fragile. And fragility means that disturbances travel faster, markets react more violently, institutions require larger interventions to remain stable, debt markets become increasingly sensitive to interest rate changes, the blueprint begins to accelerate. One of the most revealing signs of Stage 5 is the breakdown of policy predictability. Central banks begin facing contradictory objectives, controlling inflation while preventing a recession, stabilizing markets while maintaining currency credibility, supporting government debt while avoiding financial bubbles. These objectives often conflict with one another. The result is policy oscillation, tightening followed by easing, intervention followed by withdrawal. Markets begin reacting not only to economic fundamentals, but also to expectations about future interventions. In other words, the system becomes dependent on the perception of control rather than actual structural strength. This is where the illusion becomes most visible. From the outside, the empire may still appear powerful, its currency may remain dominant, its financial markets may remain large and influential, but internally the system operates under increasing strain. And history suggests that once the blueprint reaches this stage, outcomes become less predictable. Sometimes the transition happens gradually through decades of stagnation. Sometimes it accelerates through financial crises. Sometimes it ends with currency realignments or global monetary restructuring. But the key insight of the hidden blueprint is this: by the time the public recognizes the final stage, the structural transformation has already occurred. The collapse of an empire is not a single moment. It is the culmination of decades of accumulating imbalances. When people finally see the pattern clearly, the system has already crossed thresholds that cannot easily be reversed. Because the blueprint was always there, the fractures were always forming. The only difference is that now more people are beginning to see the pattern. And once you recognize the architecture of Stage 5, the question is no longer whether the system can return to its earlier form. The question becomes something far more unsettling: what replaces it?